Chapter 5. The Loneliness of Being Spiritually Awake. The room was quiet. Not the soft kind of quiet that helps you breathe easier, but the kind that sits on your chest and makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. Outside, the world kept moving. Phones kept buzzing. People kept laughing. Traffic kept rolling past the window like nothing in the universe had changed. But inside that room, one person sat still and felt the strange ache of knowing too much, seeing too much, feeling too much. It is a lonely thing to become spiritually awake, because once you start noticing what you used to overlook, you cannot unsee it. You notice the emptiness behind words that sound polished. You notice the difference between real peace and pretending. You notice how often people speak about faith while quietly living like they have none. And here's the thing. Once your heart starts waking up, it does not always make your life easier. Sometimes it makes your life quieter. Sometimes it makes your circle smaller. Sometimes it makes ordinary things feel distant. And sometimes it makes you feel like you are standing in a room full of people, while somehow still being the only one who is truly awake. That kind of loneliness does not announce itself. It does not always come with tears. Sometimes it comes with a smile. Sometimes it looks like strength. Sometimes it sounds like, "I'm fine." But deep underneath all that, there is a secret ache. The ache of being different in a way you never asked for. The ache of carrying convictions that other people only admire from a distance. The ache of wanting to talk about God in a deeper way, and realizing most conversations barely know how to go there. And if you've ever felt that, listen. You are not crazy. You are not broken. You are not being punished. You may simply be in that strange, sacred place where your soul has started to wake up, and your old life no longer fits the way it used to. That is where this story begins. Not in a church with bright lights. Not in a mountaintop moment with music swelling in the background. But in the quiet middle of an ordinary life, where one heart begins to realize that spiritual awakening can feel less like a triumph and more like a kind of loneliness. It started on a Tuesday. That's the kind of detail people forget. But the heart never does. A Tuesday afternoon, gray and still, with the kind of sky that looked unfinished. Rain had fallen earlier and left the sidewalks shining. The world outside had that washed-out look that makes everything feel a little more honest. A man sat alone at the edge of his bed, fully dressed, not because he was going anywhere, but because he had already gone somewhere inward, and he had not come back the same. He wasn't young anymore, not really. Old enough to have stories. Young enough to still hope some of them would end differently. In his hands was a worn notebook. Nothing fancy. Just a notebook with bent corners and pages that had started to curl from being opened too often. He had been writing in it for months now. Not sermons, not poems, though sometimes it read like one. Just thoughts. The kind of thoughts people have at 2 o'clock in the morning when they can no longer pretend they do not know what they know. He looked down at a page and read a line he had written the night before. "I feel closer to God and farther from everyone else." He stared at it for a long time. Then he set the notebook down like it had become heavier than paper should ever be. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? He had prayed more. He had grown quieter. He had started caring less about impressing people and more about being honest before God. He had stopped wanting noise for the sake of noise, stopped chasing the kind of approval that leaves a person empty after the applause is over. And in a way, that was good. That was growth. That was maturity. That was the kind of inner change people asked for, until it actually happened. Because once it happened, he found himself in a strange new land, not fully belonging where he used to belong. Not fully understood where he now stood. He had changed on the inside. But the world around him had not been informed. So he kept showing up to dinners, phone calls, gatherings, and conversations with a version of himself that looked normal enough to others. But inside he had become more attentive, more sensitive, more aware. He noticed the ache behind jokes, the fear behind ambition, the insecurity behind constant performance. He heard what people said, and he started hearing what they were not saying too. And that is when loneliness began. Not because people were cruel, not because they hated him, not even because they were shallow exactly. Sometimes the people around us are simply moving in a different emotional language. They are living from different questions, different wounds, different levels of awareness. And once your heart changes, even honest conversation can start to feel like standing behind glass. You can see them. They can see you. But somehow, the distance remains. He remembered the first time he felt it clearly. It was during a small gathering. Nothing dramatic. Just a living room full of people, paper plates, warm food, and talk that drifted from work to travel to families and back again. There was laughter. There was kindness. There was even affection in the room. But while everyone else spoke in easy circles, he sat there feeling the growing weight of one simple realization. He did not know how to pretend anymore. And worse, he did not want to. That is often how awakening begins. Not with a trumpet blast, with resistance. A refusal to keep performing a self that your soul no longer recognizes. Someone at the table asked him, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" He smiled. Of course he smiled. Most of us smile when we do not know how to say what is true without sounding strange. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking. Thinking." That was the safe answer. That was the socially acceptable word for 1,000 inner storms no one had asked to hear about. The conversation moved on. The plates emptied. The room stayed bright. But something in him had already stepped outside of it. Later that night, he sat in his car before driving home, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine off, just listening to the rain tick lightly against the windshield. And he thought about how often he had felt this way lately. Not depressed, not detached, just displaced, like his heart had outgrown a room he still had to keep walking through. He looked out into the dark and whispered, barely moving his lips, "Is this what it means to grow?" The question did not answer back, but in the silence he sensed something he could not fully explain. Not comfort exactly, not certainty, more like permission. Permission to admit that spiritual growth can create distance before it creates clarity. Permission to stop shaming yourself for not fitting your old patterns. Permission to recognize that becoming more aware does not always feel like becoming more connected. Sometimes it feels like being awake in a house where everyone else is still sleeping. And that is the part people do not talk about enough. They talk about peace. They talk about breakthrough. They talk about joy. They talk about wisdom. And all of that matters. But they do not always talk about the loneliness that can come when God begins to refine your vision. Because the more clearly you see, the less content you become with surface-level living. You start craving truth, not just comforting truth, real truth, The kind that can survive questions. The kind that does not panic when the room goes silent. The kind that does not need to be dressed up to be worthy. And as that hunger grows, some relationships become harder to navigate. You do not stop loving people. You just stop being able to meet them in the exact same place. You hear certain conversations and feel no desire to join in. You watch certain habits and realize you cannot keep normalizing what once felt normal. You begin to notice how much of modern life is built on distraction, and how exhausting it is to stay distracted once your spirit has started paying attention. This does not make you superior. That is important. It does not mean you are better than anyone else. It means you are becoming more honest with yourself. And honesty, real honesty, can be lonely. Because people often prefer the version of you that asks fewer questions. The version of you that is agreeable. The version of you that blends in. But spiritually awake people, they do not blend in for long. Not because they are trying to be different. Because they cannot help noticing what is no longer true for them. They cannot unfeel what they have felt. They cannot unknow what they now know. And once that happens, they begin to walk a quieter road. He started taking morning walks before sunrise, not because someone told him to, because that was the only time the world felt honest enough to hear his thoughts. The streets were almost empty then, streetlights still glowing, a few windows lit in apartment buildings, the smell of wet concrete rising from the ground, pigeons shifting on telephone wires, the city not yet awake. And in that half-light, he would walk slowly and talk to God in fragments. Not polished prayer, not perfect words, just fragments. Help me understand don't let me become bitter. Keep me soft. Show me what is real. Sometimes the prayer was simply, I feel alone. There is no shame in that prayer. None. Because it is one of the most human prayers a person can offer. And spiritual awakening often begins right there, at the edge of honesty. Not at the edge of performance, at the edge of honesty. He noticed that the more honestly he prayed, the less dramatic his inner life became, and the more serious it grew. He stopped asking for signs every 5 minutes, stopped demanding proof that God was near in some spectacular way. Not because he stopped believing, because he started noticing that presence can be quieter than certainty and deeper than emotional intensity. He began to understand that sometimes God is not absent in the silence. Sometimes silence is where God teaches the soul to stop reaching for noise as confirmation. That realization did not fix everything. It did not erase the ache. But it gave the ache a shape. And sometimes that is the beginning of peace. Not the absence of pain, the presence of meaning. A week later, his sister called. She had a way of sounding cheerful even when she was tired, which made her one of those rare people who could brighten a room without trying too hard. After the usual hello, after the usual, how are you? She said, you sound different lately. He smiled, leaning back against the kitchen counter with the phone near his ear. Different good or different bad? Different quiet. He laughed softly. She said, no, seriously. You sound farther away. That landed. Not because it was an insult, because it was true. And the truth, when spoken gently, can still make the heart flinch. He looked across the kitchen at the sink full of dishes. The one chair slightly turned away from the table. The small pile of unopened mail. Ordinary life. Familiar life. Yet somehow he felt like a guest inside it. I don't know, he said. I think I've just been thinking a lot. There it was again. Thinking a lot. The safe phrase. She was quiet for a second. Then she said something simple, something kind, something people say when they love you and do not know what else to do with your pain. Just don't isolate yourself, okay? He closed his eyes. Because that was the danger, wasn't it? Not the awakening itself. Isolation. The temptation to treat your sensitivity like a private kingdom. The temptation to protect your heart so fiercely that no one can reach you anymore. The temptation to confuse quietness with separation. He knew the risk. He had felt it. The growing habit of withdrawing before anyone could misunderstand him. The instinct to keep conversations shallow because deeper ones felt too rare to trust. The urge to pull away because being unseen hurts less than being misread. But isolation has a cost. It can slowly teach a person to survive without being known. And surviving without being known is not the same as living. He promised his sister he would be careful. After the call ended, he sat for a long time in the kitchen, phone in hand, listening to the refrigerator hum. Careful. That was the word. Not guarded. Not numb. Careful. Because a spiritual awakening requires discernment, yes. But discernment without connection can turn into loneliness dressed up as wisdom. And he was beginning to understand that there is a difference between being set apart and being shut off. One is often the work of grace. The other can become fear. There was a Sunday morning not long after that when he decided to go to church early. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to sit in the back before the room filled up. He liked the quiet before a service started. The way chairs looked when no one was seated in them yet. The way a sanctuary breathes before voices rise. The way sunlight slips across the floor through stained glass and turns ordinary dust into something almost holy. He sat alone near the rear and watched people arrive. Families with restless children. Older couples moving slowly. Young adults pretending not to check their phones. A man in a blazer with a tie slightly crooked. A woman with tired eyes and a coffee cup that looked like it had become her Sunday companion. Everyone carrying something. Some visible, some not. He watched them and felt that familiar mixture of tenderness and distance. Tenderness because he knew every soul in that room was carrying private weight. Distance because he was beginning to realize how many of those burdens were invisible even to the people sitting right beside them. The worship began. Softly at first, then fuller, then louder, and for a moment he was almost swept up in it. Almost, but not quite, because something about being spiritually awake had changed how he experienced worship too. He was no longer interested in just the atmosphere. He wanted substance. He wanted sincerity. He wanted the space between the notes to mean something. He wanted the words to reach past his emotions and into his bones. So he stood there, singing quietly, and felt both deeply moved and strangely separate. Not disconnected from God, disconnected from the ease he used to feel in crowds. And here's the thing. That separation can feel frightening until you understand that it may be part of a deeper cleansing. Not all discomfort is danger. Sometimes discomfort is the evidence that your soul is no longer willing to settle for shallow closeness. Sometimes God allows a holy restlessness to remain in you, not to punish you, but to keep you from becoming numb. That morning, when the pastor read from Scripture and spoke about endurance, he heard the words differently than he used to, not as instruction only, as recognition. He was not merely listening to a message. He was hearing his own life described in a language he had not yet found for himself. Endurance. Quiet endurance. The kind no one applauds. The kind that happens in private. The kind that looks like getting out of bed, praying again, forgiving again, waiting again, staying soft again, and refusing to become cynical even when it would be easier. The pastor's voice echoed through the room. Sometimes what feels like absence is actually a shaping. He felt his throat tighten. Because yes, that was what he had been living, shaping. Not emptiness, not abandonment, shaping. The lonely road of the awakened heart is often the road of being shaped in silence. After church, people gathered in the lobby, small clusters forming around coffee urns and folding tables. He moved through the crowd pallidly, nodding, smiling, exchanging familiar phrases. Good to see you. How have you been? Busy, you know. Busy. Another safe word. He was halfway through a conversation when an older man he respected stopped beside him and asked, "You all right?" There was something in the man's face that said he had asked the question with more depth than the words alone carried. The young man hesitated. Then, because something in that moment felt trustworthy enough, he said the truth. "Honestly, I think I'm learning how alone spiritual growth can feel." The older man did not rush to answer. He just nodded once, slowly, like he understood more than he was saying. Then he said, "It can. But alone is not the same as abandon." Those words landed like rain on dry earth. Alone is not the same as abandon. He repeated them in his mind long after the conversation ended. Because maybe that was the heart of it. Maybe spiritual loneliness had been misread in his mind as evidence that something was wrong. Maybe the silence was not proof of distance. Maybe the ache was not proof of failure. Maybe the very loneliness he feared was part of a deeper kind of formation. Still, he had to sit with the ache honestly. Because loneliness does not disappear just because it has been spiritually explained. A wound can be meaningful and still hurt. A season can be purposeful and still feel unbearable. An awakening, even when it is good, can still leave a person grieving the simplicity they used to have. He grieved it quietly. The old version of himself that could enter a room without overthinking every layer of interaction. The old ease. The old assumptions. The old belonging. He missed being less aware. There he had admitted it. Missed being less aware. Because awareness is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is the very thing that makes you feel too much. Too deeply. Too honestly. Too soon. That night he sat on the floor beside his bed, notebook open, a pen resting against his fingers, but not moving yet. The room was dark except for the small lamp by the window, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. He thought about all the people who might be feeling the same thing and never saying it. People who are growing in silence. People who are losing old interests and not yet finding new ones. People who can no longer settle for shallow faith, but have not yet found words for the depth they crave. People who smile in company and ache in private. People who love God but feel a little strange in the world. People who keep wondering why they feel so out of step with the life around them. And because he had begun to understand that loneliness often hides behind competence, he wrote something in the notebook that he needed to see with his own eyes. Maybe I am not being left behind. Maybe I am being invited inward. He read the line again. Then again, invited inward. Not away from people in any cruel sense. Inward toward truth, toward stillness. Toward a life where approval no longer runs the whole show. Toward a faith that does not depend on being understood by everyone. Toward the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full. He leaned back against the bed and closed his eyes. And in that silence, the loneliness was still there. But it was softer now. Not gone, just softened by meaning. Because meaning changes the texture of pain. It does not always remove it, but it can make it bearable. Some nights, spiritual awakening feels like courage. Other nights, it feels like grief. Grief for what used to be easy. Grief for the version of you that could laugh without thinking so much. Grief for the world before you saw the cracks. Grief for relationships that are changing because you are no longer the same person inside them. And yet, grief is not always a sign that you are losing something bad. Sometimes it is the sign that you are leaving behind something too small. That is a hard truth, a tender one, a costly one, but a true one. And he was learning, slowly, that the lonely road of awakening is often lined with these losses. The loss of superficial comfort, the loss of easy belonging, the loss of pretending, the loss of being able to fit into every room, the loss of thinking everyone else knows what they're doing while you alone are confused. Because eventually you realize everybody is carrying mystery. Everybody. The awake ones just stop pretending otherwise. And that honesty can make you feel isolated, until you realize it can also make you compassionate. He had become gentler with people, not because he understood everything, because he understood enough to know that most people are not resisting truth because they are evil. They're often just tired, afraid, defensive, wounded, busy surviving. And spiritual awakening at its best does not turn you into a judge. It turns you into a witness. A quieter witness. One who sees more clearly and loves more carefully. That is not always celebrated, but it is holy work all the same. The next week he took a long drive with no destination. Just miles. Roads. Fields. Gas stations. Clouds moving low over the highway like they were in no hurry to leave. He lowered the window and let cold air hit his face. The radio was off. He wanted the silence. Or maybe he wanted to test it, to see whether he could sit inside his own thoughts without flinching away. At first, the loneliness followed him in the car like a second shadow. Then somewhere past a stretch of trees and a sign for a town he had never heard of, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a voice from heaven, just a quiet, internal turning. He realized that the loneliness he had been naming was not only about people. It was also about expectation. He had expected spiritual growth to make him feel more at home everywhere. But perhaps what it really does first is reveal where home is not. It exposes the difference between what looks like belonging and what actually is belonging. It teaches the heart not to confuse familiarity with truth. And once the heart learns that lesson, the old places can start to feel smaller than they used to. Not because they are evil, because you have changed. That change can feel like loss, but it can also be mercy, because staying comfortable in a place that no longer fits you is its own kind of slow suffocation. He drove until the afternoon light began to fade. Then he parked beside a field and just sat there, watching the horizon soften into evening. And in that stillness, he finally allowed himself to say the thing he had been avoiding. "I do feel alone." The words were simple, almost plain, but they were true. And truth, spoken without performance, has a strange power. It does not always fix the moment, but it keeps the soul from splitting in two. He sat with that truth until it no longer felt like an accusation, until it became instead a form of surrender. Yes, I feel alone. Yes, this road is quiet. Yes, I do not fit everywhere I used to fit. Yes, I miss the ease. Yes, I am still here, still praying, still learning, still becoming. And maybe that was enough for today. There is a loneliness that comes from rejection, and there is a loneliness that comes from awakening. They are not the same. Rejection says, you are unwanted. Awakening says, you are changing. One wounds the identity. The other stretches it. One is about being cast out. The other is about being called deeper. And the difference matters. Because if you misunderstand spiritual loneliness, you may treat it like evidence that something has gone wrong. But sometimes it is evidence that something sacred is happening beneath the surface. Not always pleasant, not always visible, but real. He did not have a perfect answer for his loneliness. No one does. What he had was a growing willingness to stay present with it without collapsing into it. That is a different thing, a stronger thing. He started to notice the quiet mercy in small routines, making coffee, opening the blinds, writing one honest sentence, praying before speaking, taking a breath before reacting, sending a message instead of withdrawing, staying available. These things did not erase the ache, but they kept the ache from becoming a prison. And slowly, quietly, his life began to change shape around this new understanding. That being spiritually awake does not mean being spiritually isolated. It means being available to a deeper reality, even when that reality makes you feel alone for a season. By the time he got home that evening, the sky had gone violet and gold at the edges. He stood at the window in his apartment and watched the lights come on across the street one by one. Every window held a story. Every lit room held a private world. Everyone carrying something. Everyone hiding something. Everyone hoping, in their own way, to be known without being harmed. He rested a hand against the glass. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel like the loneliest person on earth. He felt like one lonely human among many. That may not sound like much, but it was everything. Because loneliness loses some of its power when it stops lying to you about your uniqueness, when you realize you are not the only one. Not the only one confused. Not the only one grieving growth. Not the only one whose spirit has changed faster than their surroundings. Not the only one who loves God and still feels the ache of distance. Not the only one. That truth softened him. It made him breathe easier. It made him kinder. It made him less likely to withdraw into pride and more likely to reach out with humility. And slowly he began to understand that spiritually awake people are not called to disappear from the world, but to move through it with gentleness, to notice, to listen, to love without pretending, to stay awake without becoming cold, to be honest without becoming harsh, to be deep without becoming unreachable. The balance is not easy, but it is beautiful, and beauty in a weary world is not a small thing. He picked up the notebook again before bed, turned a few pages back. read what he had written over the past weeks. Fragments, questions, prayers, lines that were half confession and half hope. Then at the bottom of a blank page he wrote, "The lonely heart is not always a lost heart. Sometimes it is a heart being made ready for a deeper kind of love." He sat with that sentence for a long time. Then he added another line below it. "Maybe being spiritually awake means I no longer belong to illusion." That one made him pause, because illusion can be comforting. It can look like community. It can sound like certainty. It can feel like peace. But when illusion breaks, the heart has to choose whether it will panic or grow. He had panicked enough already. Not outwardly. Inside. In the hidden places. Now he was choosing growth. Choosing honesty. Choosing to believe that the quiet work taking place in him was not wasted. That the loneliness was not the final word. That being awake did not mean being alone forever. Only that some seasons require a different kind of company. The company of truth. The company of silence. The company of God felt more deeply than before. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin with. The night got deeper. The apartment grew still, and in the last bit of light from the lamp, he finally bowed his head and prayed one more simple prayer. "Keep me awake, but do not let me become lonely in my own heart." There it was. Not a perfect prayer, not a dramatic prayer, but a real one. And real prayers spoken from a sincere heart often carry more weight than polished words ever could. He sat there a moment longer after the prayer ended. No thunder, no vision, no sudden change in the room. Just the quiet breathing of a man learning how to live in the tension between awakening and loneliness, between depth and distance, between grief and grace, between what has been lost and what is still being formed. And in that tension, something steady remained, not always felt, not always easy, but steady. A quiet faith, a lonely faith, a growing faith, the kind that does not shout, the kind that does not need to, the kind that keeps going in the dark, because it has learned that darkness is not the absence of God, only the place where the soul learns to trust without spectacle. So if you have felt this too, if your heart has become more awake than the world around you seems to be, if you have found yourself loving truth more deeply and feeling a little more alone because of it, listen, you are not failing. You are not fading. You are not being forgotten. You may be standing in one of the quietest, most formative seasons of your life, and though it may hurt, though it may feel slow, though it may feel like no one else understands, something sacred can still be happening here. In the silence, in the distance, in the ache, in the waiting, in the lonely spaces where your soul has finally stopped pretending. And that is where the next part of the journey begins. Not with certainty, not with applause, but with a heart that has learned how to remain open, even when it feels alone. The next morning didn't arrive with clarity. It rarely does. It arrived the way most mornings do, quietly, almost cautiously, as if the day itself was unsure what kind of person it was waking up. The light slipped in through the curtains, thin and pale, stretching across the floor like it didn't want to disturb anything. He opened his eyes slowly. Not tired, but not fully rested either. That kind of in-between state where your body has slept, but your mind has been walking all night. And for a moment, before thoughts rushed back in, there was stillness, a fragile kind of peace. But then it came, a familiar awareness, a quiet weight, not overwhelming, not crushing, just present, like something sitting beside him, not speaking, but refusing to leave. Loneliness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays. And here's the thing. The deeper your awareness grows, the less you can distract yourself from what stays. He sat up, ran a hand across his face, and let out a slow breath. "All right," he whispered to no one in particular. Not as resistance, as acceptance. Because he was beginning to understand something important. You cannot outrun a season meant to shape you. You can only walk through it. He didn't reach for his phone immediately. That was new. There was a time when mornings began with noise, messages, notifications, endless scrolling that made him feel connected without actually connecting him to anything real. But lately he had stopped, not because someone told him to, because he noticed how empty it left him. And once you notice emptiness clearly enough, it becomes harder to keep choosing it. So instead he sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, and just breathed. No music, no distraction, no performance, just presence. It felt uncomfortable at first. It always does, because silence has a way of holding up a mirror, and not everyone is ready for what they'll see there. But he stayed. Because something in him had grown tired of avoiding himself, and slowly, something else began to emerge. Not answers, not solutions, just a quiet awareness of his own existence, of his own breath, of his own soul. Learning how to sit without needing to escape. That is a kind of strength people rarely talk about. The strength to stay. Later that day, he met a friend for coffee. One of the few people he still felt safe around. Not because the friend understood everything, because the friend didn't pretend to. They sat across from each other, 2 cups between them, steam rising gently like the conversation hadn't started yet. "How have you been?" the friend asked. He paused. This time he didn't want to give the easy answer. "Different," he said. The friend nodded, waiting. That mattered. Being with someone who doesn't rush your honesty is rare. "Different how?" the friend asked. He looked down at the table for a second, tracing a small circle with his finger. Then he said it. "I feel like I'm waking up to things, and it's making everything feel quieter, but also heavier." The friend leaned back slightly, not pulling away, making space. He continued. "It's like I see more now about people, about myself, about faith, and I don't know what to do with it. I can't go back to how I used to be, but I don't fully belong where I am either." There it was, the space between, the in-between place, where transformation lives. The friend didn't offer a quick solution, didn't quote anything, didn't try to fix him, just said something simple. "That sounds lonely." And somehow, those words carried more comfort than any explanation could have. Because being understood, even partially, can soften a weight that felt impossible alone. He nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." They sat in silence for a moment. Not awkward, not forced, just human. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not the loneliness itself, but the way it felt. It no longer felt like something he had to hide. And sometimes that's the first crack in the wall. Here's the truth most people don't say out loud. Spiritual awakening doesn't just change how you see God. It changes how you see everything. Conversations, relationships, success, time, even yourself. And when everything begins to shift like that, you can feel like you've lost your footing, because the ground that once felt solid now feels temporary. And the ground that is forming is still unseen. That's where faith becomes real. Not in certainty, in transition. And transition is almost always lonely, because not everyone can walk with you there. Not because they don't care, because they're not in the same place. And that's okay. But it still hurts. That evening he went for another walk. Not because he had planned it, because something inside him had started to crave movement when his thoughts got too heavy. The sky was clearer this time. Fewer clouds, more stars. And there's something about looking at the sky that makes your problems feel both smaller and more meaningful at the same time. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cool air. And as he walked, a thought came to him. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. Maybe this loneliness isn't meant to isolate me, but to refine what I depend on. He stopped walking, because that thought felt different. It didn't remove the loneliness, but it gave it direction, refinement. That word stayed with him, because refining isn't comfortable. It involves heat, pressure, change. It removes what cannot stay to reveal what must. And maybe, just maybe, this season wasn't about losing connection. It was about losing illusion. The illusion that constant noise equals connection. The illusion that being surrounded equals being known. The illusion that easy conversations equal deep relationships. The illusion that faith always feels full and clear. Those illusions had slowly been falling apart, and what remained felt quieter, but also more real. He resumed walking, slower now, more aware, more present. And for the first time, he didn't try to escape the loneliness. He observed it, felt it, sat with it while still moving forward. And something subtle began to happen. It lost a bit of its edge, because when you stop fighting a feeling, it often stops fighting you. It becomes something you can carry, instead of something that carries you. A few days later, he found himself sitting in a crowded place again. Different setting, same feeling. People talking, laughing, sharing stories, and him, listening. But this time, something had changed. He wasn't resisting the distance. He wasn't trying to force himself to feel what he used to feel. He was simply present, observing, understanding, and strangely, that made him more compassionate. Because instead of feeling separate in a painful way, he started seeing people more clearly. Not just what they said, but what they needed. He noticed the person who laughed a little too loudly. The one who kept checking their phone like they were waiting for something that never came. The one who spoke confidently but avoided eye contact when things got personal. The one who stayed quiet, like him. And in that awareness, something softened. Because loneliness had stopped being only about him. It became a doorway into understanding others. And that's a shift many people miss. Spiritual awakening is not just about seeing your own soul more clearly. It's about seeing others with more depth, too. And that depth can turn loneliness into compassion. He didn't say much that night, but when he did, his words were slower, more intentional, less about filling space, more about meaning something. And people noticed. Not everyone, but a few. And sometimes, a few is enough, because deep connection rarely happens in crowds. It happens in moments, in pauses, in honesty, in presence. That night back home, he sat with his notebook again, But this time, he didn't start writing immediately. He just held the pen, thinking, feeling, letting the day settle inside him. And then he wrote, "Loneliness showed me what shallow connection could never give me." He paused, then added, "It made me stop pretending and start seeing." He leaned back, exhaling slowly, because for the first time, the loneliness didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a teacher. A hard one, but an honest one. Listen, if you're in this place right now, where your heart feels more awake than your surroundings, where conversations feel thinner than they used to, where your inner world feels deeper, but also heavier, where you find yourself alone more often, not because you want to be, but because you can't pretend anymore, you're not going backwards. You're not losing your place. You're not becoming disconnected from life. You are becoming more aligned with truth. And truth takes time to build a life around. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't immediately replace what was lost. It grows slowly, quietly, like roots beneath the surface. And roots are built in hidden places. He closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and lay down. The room was quiet again, but it felt different now. Not empty, just still. And in that stillness, he realized something he hadn't before. Loneliness had been loud when he resisted it, but when he accepted it, it became quieter. Not gone, but quieter. And in that quiet, something else could finally be heard. Not a voice, not words, just presence. A steady, unshaken presence that had been there all along. He didn't fully understand it, didn't need to. For the first time, understanding didn't feel necessary. Being present did, and that was enough. For now. Because the journey wasn't over, not even close. There were still questions, still moments of distance, still days where the weight would return stronger than expected. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer afraid of the loneliness in the same way, because he had seen what it was doing. Not breaking him, shaping him, not removing him from life, repositioning him within it, not isolating him permanently, preparing him for a deeper connection later. And maybe that's where you are too, right in the middle of it, not at the beginning, not at the end, in the middle, where things feel unclear, where growth feels slow, where loneliness feels real, but something deeper is quietly forming. And if that's where you are, stay. Stay with it, stay present, stay open, because what feels like distance right now may be the very thing creating space for something more real than you've ever known. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when something inside you stops resisting what you've been feeling for a long time. Not because the feeling disappears, but because you finally understand it's not going anywhere. And strangely, that's where the turning point begins. Not when everything changes, but when you stop expecting it to. A few days passed. Normal days on the surface. Work, meals, conversations that came and went. The kind of days that don't leave a mark on anyone else, but quietly shape something inside you. And during those days, something subtle was happening. He wasn't trying as hard anymore. Not in a careless way. In a surrendered way. He stopped trying to feel right. Stopped trying to recreate old emotions. Stopped trying to fix the loneliness like it was a problem that needed solving. Instead, he began to observe his life as it was, and that shift changed everything. One evening, while sitting by the window, he noticed something he had never really paid attention to before: the rhythm of the world. Cars passing. Lights flickering on and off in nearby buildings. A distant dog barking. Someone laughing far away. Life continuing. Unaware of his internal struggle, and for the first time, instead of feeling disconnected from it, he felt included in it. Not because anything external had changed, because something internal had softened. Here's the thing. Loneliness often feels sharpest when you believe it separates you from everything. But when you begin to see yourself as part of the same human experience, even in your quietest moments, the edge softens. You're not outside of life. You're inside it, just at a deeper layer. And deeper layers are quieter. That night, he didn't reach for distraction. He didn't try to fill the silence. He let it be. And in that space, a question rose up. Not from fear, from curiosity. What if this is where I'm meant to grow? He didn't answer it immediately, because real questions deserve space. So he sat with it. Let it settle. Let it breathe. And slowly, another thought followed. What if I've been calling this loneliness when it's actually transition? That word again. Transition. Not loss. Not failure. Movement. Becoming. The space between what was and what will be. And suddenly, things started making sense. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to see that this wasn't random. That this season had a purpose, even if it didn't feel comfortable. Because growth rarely feels comfortable, especially the kind that happens deep within. The next morning, something changed in how he moved through his day. Not dramatically, but noticeably. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, still aware, but there was less tension, less resistance, less need to explain himself, even to himself. And that created space. Space to breathe. Space to notice. Space to connect differently. Later that afternoon, he received a message. Simple, unexpected, for someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. Hey, I don't know why, but I felt like checking on you. How are you really doing? He stared at the message for a moment, because timing like that always feels intentional. Not in a dramatic, mystical way, but in a deeply human way. Connection, finding its way through quiet spaces. He didn't rush his reply, didn't overthink it, just wrote, I've been going through something, but I think I'm starting to understand it. He hit send, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel the need to explain more. Because understanding doesn't always need to be shared fully. Sometimes it just needs to be felt. That evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of gold fading into blue, he went outside again. Not to escape, not to think, just to be. And as he walked, he noticed something different. The same streets, the same air, the same quiet. But his experience of it had changed, because the loneliness was no longer something he was fighting. It was something he was carrying, with awareness. And awareness transforms experience. He stopped near a small park, sat on a bench, watched as a few people passed by, some alone, some together. Each one in their own world. And it hit him. Everyone is carrying something. Everyone is navigating something unseen. Everyone is, in some way, alone in their experience, and yet connected in that shared reality. That realization didn't make his loneliness disappear, but it changed how it felt. It no longer felt isolating. It felt human. And that's the turning point many people miss. Loneliness becomes dangerous when it convinces you that you are separate. But when you see it as part of the human condition, it becomes something else, something you can move through, something you can understand, something that can even deepen your connection with others. Because now, he wasn't just aware of his own inner world, he was aware of everyone else's. Not in detail, but in essence. And that awareness created compassion, real compassion, not surface-level kindness, deep understanding, the kind that doesn't judge quickly, the kind that listens longer, the kind that sees beyond behavior into what might be underneath. That night back home, he didn't feel the same heaviness, not because everything was resolved, because something had shifted in perspective, and perspective can change the weight of a season. He opened his notebook again, but this time his words came differently, less heavy, more clear. He wrote, "This isn't loneliness, this is depth." He paused, then added, "I've been learning to live where fewer people go, but where everything is more real." He sat back, let the words settle, because they felt true, not in a way that rejected people, but in a way that understood himself. Listen. There is a difference between being alone and being aligned. At first, they feel the same, because both remove you from noise, both create distance, both feel unfamiliar. But alignment carries peace beneath the surface. Even when it's quiet, even when it's slow, even when it feels like no one else understands. He lay down that night, not with answers, but with acceptance. And that made all the difference. Because peace doesn't always come from knowing everything. Sometimes it comes from no longer needing to. Days turned into a week, then another, and slowly life continued. But he was different within it. He spoke less, but meant more. He connected less widely, but more deeply. He felt things more, but reacted less. He was still on the journey, still growing, still navigating, but no longer lost inside it. And here's where everything comes together. Spiritual awakening doesn't remove loneliness. It transforms it. It takes something that once felt like emptiness and reveals it as space. Space for truth. Space for growth. Space for deeper connection when the time is right. And if you've been walking through this, if you've felt the quiet distance, if you've questioned why everything feels different, if you've wondered whether something is wrong with you, listen carefully. Nothing is wrong with you. You are not falling behind. You are not losing connection. You are moving into a deeper experience of life, and that takes adjustment. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes trust. And most of all, it takes the willingness to stay present, stay open, stay honest, even when it feels lonely, because what you're building right now cannot be rushed. And one day, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, you will realize You are no longer lonely in the same way. Not because the world changed, because you did. You will walk into rooms and not feel the need to belong the same way. You will have conversations that feel lighter, but still meaningful. You will recognize depth in others more quickly. You will find connection, not everywhere, but where it truly matters. And it will feel enough, more than enough. So don't rush this season. Don't escape it too quickly. Don't label it as something negative before understanding what it's doing. Because this quiet, this space, this loneliness may be one of the most important seasons of your life. And as you continue forward, take this with you. You are not alone in feeling alone. And that changes everything. There is a kind of quiet that only comes after a long internal struggle. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence that remains when you stop fighting what your soul has been trying to show you all along. And that is where he found himself. Not at the end of the journey, but no longer at war with it. The room looked the same walls, the same chair, the same window where light had come and gone so many times without asking how he felt about it. Nothing outside had changed, but inside, something had settled. He sat down slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was finally still, and listened. There is a difference. You can be tired and restless, or still and at peace. And for the first time in a long time, he felt both the weight and the quiet strength of stillness. The loneliness hadn't disappeared. Let's be honest about that. It didn't vanish overnight. It didn't suddenly turn into constant joy. It was still there, but it no longer felt like something was missing. It felt like something was being held. That's the shift. That's the moment many people never reach, because they tried to escape too soon. He stopped asking, "Why do I feel this?" and started accepting. This is where I am, and I'm still okay. And when a person reaches that place, they become different. Not louder, not more impressive, but deeper, more grounded, more real. That night he didn't write immediately. He just sat there, hands resting, breathing slow, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with thoughts. He let it exist, fully, completely, and something unexpected happened. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of presence, full of awareness, full of something he couldn't fully explain, but no longer needed to. And maybe that's what spiritual maturity begins to look like. Not having all the answers, but no longer being disturbed by their absence. He finally reached for the notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote slowly, not out of confusion, but clarity. I thought awakening would make me feel closer to everything. He paused, then continued. But it made me feel alone first, so I could learn what real connection actually is. He sat with that, let it settle, because it carried truth, a quiet kind of truth, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. Then he wrote again. I thought loneliness meant something was wrong, a breath. But now I see it was creating space for something deeper. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Memories moved through him. The confusion, the distance, the questions, the nights that felt heavier than they should have, the conversations that felt empty, the quiet walks, the unanswered feelings. All of it. And instead of resisting those memories, he honored them because they brought him here. Listen, there are seasons in your life where nothing feels clear, where everything feels different, where the version of you that once fit into the world so easily no longer exists, and it feels like loss. It feels like distance. It feels like loneliness. But what if it's not loss? What if it's refinement? What if the reason you feel out of place is because you're no longer meant to belong to the same patterns? What if the silence isn't empty, but sacred? What if the loneliness is not the absence of connection, but the preparation for something real enough to finally hold you without pretending? He opened his eyes, and something in him knew. He wasn't the same person who sat on this floor weeks ago, confused and searching. He had not found all the answers, but he had found something more important: stability within uncertainty. And that changes how you walk through life. You stop chasing constant validation. You stop forcing conversations that don't feel real. You stop shrinking your awareness just to feel comfortable again. You stop pretending to be who you were just to fit into spaces that no longer hold you. And instead, you begin to live quietly, honestly, present. You begin to recognize depth, even in silence. You begin to feel connection, even without constant interaction. You begin to understand that not every space is meant for you, and not every season is meant to feel full. Because fullness doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes it comes from alignment. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the world that had never stopped moving, even when he felt like he had. And for the first time, he didn't feel behind. He didn't feel disconnected. He didn't feel like something was wrong. He felt present. And presence is where everything begins to change. Because when you are present, you stop comparing. You stop rushing. You stop escaping. You start noticing. You start understanding. You start becoming. And maybe that's what this entire season was about. Not isolation, not confusion, not distance, but becoming. Becoming someone who can sit in silence without fear. Becoming someone who can feel deeply without breaking. Becoming someone who doesn't need constant noise to feel alive. Becoming someone who knows that being spiritually awake means walking a quieter path, but a more meaningful one. And if you've made it this far, if you've stayed through the silence, if you've felt this loneliness in your own life, then hear this slowly. Let it land. You are not alone in this. Even if it feels that way sometimes, even if your surroundings don't reflect your inner world, even if conversations don't reach the depth you now crave, even if people don't fully understand the version of you you're becoming, you see, you are not alone. There are others, walking the same quiet path, feeling the same depth, learning the same stillness, growing in ways that cannot always be explained out loud. And more importantly, you are not abandoned. Even in the silence, even in the distance, even in the moments where everything feels unclear, something is still holding you. Something is still shaping you. Something is still guiding you, even when you don't feel it clearly. So don't rush out of this season. Don't escape it too quickly. Don't numb it. Don't label it as failure. Sit with it. Learn from it. Let it refine you. Let it deepen you. Let it prepare you. Because one day, you will look back at this quiet season and realize it didn't break you. It built you. Built a version of you. That doesn't depend on constant noise. That doesn't need to be understood by everyone. That doesn't lose itself in the crowd. That knows how to stand alone without feeling lost. And that is a different kind of strength. A quiet strength. A steady strength. A real strength. So if this spoke to you, if somewhere in this story you saw yourself, then don't keep it to yourself. There are more people out there feeling this, but not knowing how to put it into words. Share this with them. Let them know they're not alone either. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Soul Spire, because this journey doesn't end here. There's more depth, more truth, more quiet revelations waiting ahead. Go back and watch the earlier chapters. You'll start seeing connections you didn't notice before, and continue forward. Because what comes next might meet you exactly where you are now. Until then, stay present, stay honest, stay open, even in the quiet. Because sometimes